Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for what you need to know about GDPR. My name is Alex Wong. I am the Director of Marketing at SmartSimple. If you've never met me at any of our Elevate conferences, annual conferences, or block parties, I've been with the company for about 2.5 years now, and I've been tasked with presenting to you some of the research that we've uncovered from doing our research on GDPR. So just to set the table for everybody, we've been researching GDPR and getting ourselves prepared for GDPR for a couple months now. My colleague Megan Keogh has been doing a lot of work around it. Now, that being said, I should mention the fact that by no means are we experts on GDPR. So what I would suggest is, while we're happy to share all of the information and research that we've uncovered, if you are planning on making any operational changes with your organization with regards to GDPR and compliance, I would highly recommend that you speak to other folks as well, just to make sure that the things that we're sharing with you are on par with everyone else's line of thinking. Now, we've got a lot to cover today, so I just want to really just jump into it. Now, we can take questions along the way, but what I will do is I will field the questions at the end of the presentation because there is really a lot of information to cover. You'll notice a chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. So if you do have questions, type it into there and we can take the questions up afterwards. So this is what our agenda looks like. There's 5 segments to the presentation. Now, first what we'll do is we'll provide an overview on the law and what your responsibilities are under it. We'll also discuss the scope, some definitions, key principles, as well as the rights of the data subject and what it really means for you. Now, while signing up for the webinar, I know most of you answered that you like to learn general tips and steps, as well as how SmartSimple can help you comply. These 2 segments will really be a main focus of the webinar. And then, as I said, what we'll do is once we wrap up, we'll have a Q&A session. So again, enter your questions into the chat box and we can take them up towards the end there. Now, throughout the presentation, I'll be referring and referencing quotes from UK Information Commissioner Elizabeth Denham. She actually did a speech back in 2017 on GDPR, and most of the law is really quite vague, but Elizabeth's comments in her speech really shed light on the essence of the legislation itself and what the people writing the law were trying to achieve. So one of the actual things that she talked about was, in her speech was, and I quote, "We're all going to have to change how we think about data protection." And very fundamentally, GDPR really does that, which is why we're having this conversation today. So I want to do a quick overview of GDPR, a little bit of history and where we've gotten to where we are now. So GDPR, if you're not aware, stands for General Data Protection Regulation. It was passed by the EU back in April 2016, and there's been a 2-year transition period for everyone to get themselves organized. It goes into effect on May 25th of this year, so that's 80 days away from today, so which is it's not a lot of time if you haven't really thought about GDPR, but I guess it's enough time for you to start taking some action. Now, GDPR is replacing the Data Protection Act. Well, why? The DPA was instituted back in 1998, so really it's quite outdated, and really it was inadequate in dealing with today's reality of big data, technological advances, especially those utilized by folks like me, marketers. So, so that's a big reason why GDPR has been instituted. Now, the PECR, or the Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulations, was established back in 2003, and basically it's a set of regulations regarding marketing and advertising. So things like cookies, telephone directories, traffic data, location data, or security breaches are all things that are covered under the PECR. Now, at the moment, the PECR is in the process of being replaced by a new e-privacy regulation, but the regulation is still tentative at this point in time, so we don't have to worry about it just yet. Now, there are, however, a lot of things in the GDPR that regulate marketing and the data collected through marketing practices. So I speak a lot about marketing, but really what we're talking about is communication, so you have to keep that in mind. So I want to take a minute now and talk about the how and the why of GDPR. And let's start off with the how. So how they're enforcing the legislation. Well, they're going to be enforcing the legislation through fines. It's going to be a tiered fine system with a maximum amount of fines being set at 20 million euro or 4% of an organization's revenue, whichever is higher. Now, from our research, we haven't been able to find specific details on the tiers, but it will most likely be decided as it happens, as many of the law's practical applications are, at this point, ambiguous. And actually, for folks that are based in Canada who've had to deal with the anti-spam legislation, the way they're approaching the law and how they're unfolding it really is following sort of a similar model to how the anti-spam legislation was unrolled here in Canada, whereby a lot of it was left with gray area and a lot of ambiguity. And a lot of the reason why they did that is because a lot of situations and scenarios hadn't played itself out yet where they would actually have to come up with a solution for that particular scenario. And so I think what they're trying to do with the GDPR is something very similar to that. And when they have a precedent that's set, that's when they're going to start dealing with it. But that being said, officials are really trying to take a severe posture in regards to the fines, as demonstrated in the significant possible fines that can be levied by the legislation. Now let's go to the why. Why is this legislation happening? Well, beyond just updating the Data Protection Act, the GDPR really is necessary because it's designed to harmonize data privacy laws across Europe and protect and empower all EU citizens' data privacy and reshape the way organizations across the region approach data privacy. Now, ultimately, as again, I'm going to reference Elizabeth Denham points out, it all really comes down to the notion of accountability, and makes a whole lot of sense if you're talking about folks' data and private information. Now let's take a minute to talk about the scope of GDPR and who is ultimately responsible for the legislation itself. Now, there are essentially four groups of people who are obligated to comply with the GDPR. So the first one is if you're an organization who has a controller or processor activities established in the EU, regardless of where the processing occurs. I'm going to take a minute later on in the presentation to talk about what exactly a controller is and what a processor is. Now, the next three groups are folks that aren't established in the EU, but you're still expected to comply with GDPR if you're offering goods or services to people in the EU, if you're monitoring the behavior of EU residents, or if you're obligated via a contract, or if you're in a location that EU law applies. So the scope of this legislation is really quite broad, and it really does have some global ramifications. So at this point, I want to talk about some definitions, because certainly with the legislation, there are a lot of definitions that need to be discussed. The terms I'm going to talk about are really featured prominently in the legislation itself. I'm not going to go into full detail and read out the full definitions, but what we're going to do is we're going to make this deck available to everybody after the webinar, so you'll have all of my speakers' notes and such at your disposal. But essentially, there are four terms that you'll see throughout the legislation. The first one is personal data. If you read the definition for personal data, it isn't new, and you may have actually read it in a version of it from previous legislations like the Data Protection Act. But the main difference to point out here is that the definition of personal data really has greatly expanded. So it includes things like IP addresses and things that you wouldn't have seen or had to worry about because of the technology at that point in time back in 1998 when the Data Protection Act was actually enacted. Processing is another key term that is prevalent throughout the entire legislation. You basically see it everywhere in the law itself. And then, in a nutshell, what processing refers to is any operation or set of operations which is performed on a personal data such as collection, recording, organization, or storage. And that brings us to the definition of controller and processor. Now, these are basically the two types of bodies that are being held accountable to comply with the law. In layman's terms, what a data controller is it's a person who determines the purposes for which and the manner in which any personal data are or are to be processed. And I'll explain what the roles look like in just a minute in terms of who we are, SmartSimple is, and who you are as a client. Data processor, okay? A data processor is any person other than an employee of the data controller who processes data on behalf of the data controller. So think about it from the perspective of you being a SmartSimple client and SmartSimple being the vendor. Now, in this relationship, SmartSimple is actually the processor, and you, our client, are the controller. Now, controllers and processors have tons of added responsibilities under law, which I'm going to get to it a little bit later on. Now, this is really the meat of the legislation itself, because basically the legislation is broken down into main principles, and it's these main principles that really guide the essence of what the law is all about. So if you notice, the first thing I mentioned there is processing. There is a lot involved with processing, and they actually have principles on how to process itself. So I'm going to get into that in just a minute. But I'm going to talk about some of the other ones right now. Consent is basically the principle around how consent must be freely given, specific, informed, and ambiguous. There has to be a clear affirmative action signifying agreement to the processing of personal data. I mean, the reality is, gone are the days of pre-tick boxes being adequate for consent or consent being applied by non-action. It's also worth noting that consent can also be withdrawn. Transparency and accountability, again, they prevail throughout the entire piece of legislation, but data breach I want to talk about in a little bit more detail, because once a data breach notifications today are mandatory, and they have to be reported within 72 hours. So if you've read the news stories about Uber and their data breach a couple months ago, the fact that they didn't disclose it, and the fact they didn't disclose it within 72 hours would have put them in a huge jeopardy in terms of liability and non-compliance with the GDPR legislation itself. Special categories of personal data. So what this principle is really talking about is it's talking about things like personal information like health, sex life, race, ethnicity, political beliefs, really can't be processed unless it's exempt from it by the GDPR, for example, like when there is explicit consent. So this really talks about how the data is being collected and the processes around that. Legitimate interests. This principle talks about how, this one's a little bit confusing, but it applies to marketing and sales and has its own regulation on what legitimate interest really means. But basically what it's saying is that it's more difficult to claim legitimate interest now than it was before. Privacy by design. This principle talks about how the protection of data should be taken into account while a system is being designed rather than being an addition after the fact. So you really holistically have to think about the protection of data from the ground up. Data privacy needs to be built into processing practices. There really shouldn't be any frivolous processing, and only people who are qualified and need to view or process this information should have access to it. Data protection officer. Now, this isn't so much a principle as it is a requirement for the controller. And basically what it is organizations need to appoint a DPO or a data protection officer if their processing operations monitor data subjects on a large scale, or if they process a large scale of special categories, which I've mentioned earlier in the special categories of personal data, or if you have 200 or more employees. So if you fit under any of those criteria, then you will have to assign a data protection officer internally. And finally, rights. So rights are a really important part of the principles of the GDPR. I'm going to expand on that in just a minute because I want to talk about the rights of the data subject, because they've really been much more clearly defined in this legislation. But I want to backtrack for just a second because I want to talk about the processing principles. I mentioned a couple minutes ago that processing is a really big part of the legislation itself, and there are a lot of things that need to be considered in terms of how data can be properly processed. And essentially, there are 6 principles to data processing. The first one is purpose limitation. And basically what purpose limitation means is that data shouldn't be processed further than the initial purposes. So essentially you need to have a specific reason for processing the data, and you need to define that reason. Data minimization is another aspect of processing, and really it's saying that you can only process data that's necessary for the initial purposes that you intended to. So if you look at the comparison between what purpose limitation and data minimization means, purpose limitation talks about your reason for collecting data, whereas data minimization is the type of data that you are actually collecting during the processing. I hope that's clear. The third principle of processing is accuracy. So data should be kept up to date and ensure inaccurate data is rectified. Storage limitation talks about how data needs to be kept for as long as it's necessary, and there should not be any data hoarding. So if you're processing data, you can only keep it for as long as you actually need it for that specific purpose. Integrity and confidentiality. You must protect data against unauthorized or unlawful processing. I think that goes without saying, but obviously they made it a point to make sure that that was detailed in the GDPR legislation itself. And of course, the last is accountability. Being able to demonstrate compliance really is a must. I actually miscounted here. There are actually 7 processing principles, but the last one is lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. I got to talk about this a little bit more because there are more details around the lawfulness of processing. So there are key principles around how you process data lawfully. And really there are 6 criteria under which it's lawful to process data. So these include consent, performance of a contract, compliance with a legal obligation, if you are processing data to protect the vital interests of a data subject, if you're processing data to carry out in the public interest, or if you have legitimate interest for processing data. So the first one that I mentioned, the first criteria, consent, is really the important one. It's one of the key ideas of the law. So I mentioned earlier that the rights of the data subject, and by data subject, who I'm really talking about is I'm talking about the individual whose data is being collected and being processed. That's who I'm talking about. So I want to take a moment to talk about the data subject and what the rights are that he or she is entitled to, because this legislation really empowers the data subject to take ownership of their own data and to have really a say into how it's being used and how it's being processed by the controller and the processor. So what you see on the screen are the rights of the data subject. Now the data subject can actually make any number of requests based on the rights that I've listed here. Each of these rights are individual articles within the law, meaning that they have paragraphs and subparagraphs. And basically they're really quite nuanced, and they go into a lot of detail in terms of what is covered under the rights of the data subject. In the interest of time though, again, I will share with you the speaker's notes afterwards, but I'm going to go over these in some brief detail. So the first data subject right is information and communication. So basically, this right says that the data subject needs to be made aware of their rights as a data subject, how their data is being collected, and how it's being used. The second right is the right of access, and basically it means that data subjects should be able to access any data held on them. The third is a right to rectification. This right stipulates that data subjects can make a request to the controller to update inaccurate information if the data is not up to date. And of course, this was a guiding principle in one of the processing principles I mentioned earlier. The right to restriction of processing. Now this right talks about how the data subject has the right to request how their data is being processed under certain circumstances. The right to object. The right to object gives the data subject the right to request that their data no longer be processed completely by the controller. So an example of where this might be applicable would be, for example, in a lawsuit where processing of a data subject may need to stop, but because past data may be required to support the suit, the data may not necessarily be wiped completely clean. The next right is right to erasure, or also known as the right to be forgotten. And basically, data subjects can request for all their data be completely erased. And finally, the last right is the right to data portability. Basically, the data subject can ask for their data to be transferred from one controller to another in a smooth and timely process. Now, all of these rights being said, they're based on the idea of undue delay as well. So what that means is that if a request has been made, it has to be turned over within a month, and that is stipulated in the legislation. Also, it's not enough to just hand over a chunk of data to the data subject. It also needs to be easy for them to understand and accessible and in plain language. And in plain language, in their definition, means reading at a reading level of a child. So really, these are things that really need to be considered, and especially when you're dealing with the rights of the data subject, that you really must adhere to these particular requirements. So I've gone over the principles, I've talked about some of the key players. At this point, I really want to talk about how your organization is going to be affected, because besides seeing a lot of cookie pop-ups when you visit a website, the regulation will really have a big impact on how you guys run your business. You'll have responsibilities as a controller that you may not have had in the past. Now, before GDPR, responsibilities around integrity and protection of data really flowed from the controller to the processor. Again, in our context, our clients are the controller and SmartSimple is the processor. Now, with GDPR, there's a new division of responsibilities between the controller and the processor. The processor has a distinct list of responsibilities it has to comply with. We'll talk about that a little bit more detail. Now, the processor has a greater role to play, but ultimately, it's still the responsibility of the controller. In other words, you, our clients, facilitate the rights of the data subject. Beyond that, they're also responsible for, again, the responsibility of the controller are the things I've highlighted in this slide right here. So the facilitation of rights, the selecting of a processor, ensuring the lawfulness of processing, providing of information taken on a request under Articles 15 to 22, providing the data subject information when personal data on the data subject is being collected, ensuring that only personal data which is necessary is being collected, and of course, maintaining a record of all processing activities. So those are your responsibilities as a controller. I want to talk about nonprofits just a second, because I know a lot of folks online right now are nonprofits. Now, in the eyes of the GDPR, there really is no distinguishing between a for-profit and a nonprofit entity. The reason for this is because the nature of the organization is really irrelevant to the rights of the data subject. Now, campaigning for charities is covered under definition of direct marketing. So in order to directly market to a group or individual, you need to meet one of the 6 lawful bases for processing that we discussed earlier. But most likely the lawful bases that will be relevant to you are either consent or legitimate interest. Now, there's also a fundraising regulator, which is a code of fundraising practice that goes beyond the GDPR requirements for nonprofits. But this code is really a resource for nonprofits, and it aims to set standards, develop best practices, and answer concerns. Tips and steps to ensure compliance. So that's really the next step, and this is a portion of the presentation where I want to talk about how SmartSimple can help you facilitate getting yourself compliant with the legislation itself. Again, I want to point out something that Elizabeth Denham mentioned, and she talks about how the lens by which GDPR should be looked at should be beyond the legislation itself and more towards developing best practices. And it's really a philosophy and culture of strong privacy practices around data. So while the legislation itself is punitive by nature because there are fines attached to it, I think what they're trying to say is that the essence of the law is really to try and standardize best practice across the board in the EU and how organizations deal with data. So I think that's something important to keep in mind, that while again there are penalties that can be levied against you for not being non-compliant, the whole idea is this legislation is to help you facilitate getting you towards working towards best practices around data protection. Now, that said, what steps can you take to ensure your compliance? Well, one of the things that we've done here is we've actually developed a model that we follow to try and help ourselves remain compliant, and I want to share that with you guys. Basically, we've developed a model called the SIMPLE model, and there's 6 main parts to it. The first one is sharpening security and privacy by design. The second part is implementing relevant procedures. Next is making transparency your priority. Protect the rights of your clients. Look over your current practices. And finally, empower your people. And if you notice, we've done this little key thing where the acronym actually spells out simple. Now, we actually detail the SIMPLE model in a GDPR guide that we've actually created. The guide's really structured as a self-assessment. It's got over 50 questions to prompt you and your organization to critique your current practices and push you in the right direction. I'm going to, in the next couple of slides, I'm going to mention some of the key questions that come out of the self-assessment. But the document's available for you guys, free to download. We can send you the link, and really, I think this is an important first step for you to sort of do an evaluation of yourself and spend some time with. Okay, so let's go over some of the key questions related to the model itself in the different sections. So the first one was sharpen security and privacy by design. There are a couple of key questions I want to point out. The first one is, do you have a process in place for data breach notifications? Do you know what security measures your processors have in place? And are you aware of your security responsibilities as a controller? Now, the last 2 questions I just mentioned are really important, since controllers really tend to think that security falls under the processor's responsibilities. I just mentioned earlier, a couple slides ago, that the controller has a lot of responsibilities they have to think about and they've really got to consider. So the next step in the model is implementing relevant procedures. Some of the key questions I would really pay attention to are, do you need to appoint a data protection officer? Again, there are specific requirements around that, and I mentioned that earlier in the presentation. Do you need to change or update any of your contracts with your processors? Really, you need to implement procedures that facilitate the constant review of your processes. Compliance is not an end goal. It's really an ongoing obligation. And to create an environment at your organization that's continually reviewing, evaluating, and revising. So, I mean, if you think about your policies and procedures, it's an ongoing evolution. It's always going to change. And it's important that you always treat it as an organic thing that you really need to always continue to have an eye on. Making transparency your priority. So again, some of the questions I would really pay attention to are you record-keeping practices up to par? Are the contract details of your organization's clients easy to understand? Are these contracts easy to reach if a client has a question? Are you providing the data subject with all the information you can regarding your data and its processing? Important things to consider. In the next section, which is protecting your rights, are you aware of the criteria for which it is lawful to process data? Do you have a procedure in place to ensure that the reason for processing is lawful before the processing occurs? And hopefully, again, this overview that we're doing with this webinar can help you answer some of these questions. Do you have a process in place for if a data subject withdraws consent to process their data? If you expect your organization to receive a lot of information or action requests from data subjects regarding their personal data, do you have the functionality in place to properly track these requests, ensuring a timely turnover of 1 month? So this is a really important piece because, again, we're only 80 days away from the legislation going live. If you haven't thought about these processes, and mind you, how quickly you can implement these things really depend on how quickly and how nimble you are as an organization, but these processes can be quite drawn out and can be quite complicated. So I really think it's important that you really think about the processes and how you are actually going to deal with these requests from the data subject if they ask you to purge their data, for example. The L, which is looking over your current practices. What are your data collection procedures and purposes? What data do you collect and why? Again, you constantly have to be asking yourself this because you have to make sure that you're actually processing the data that you actually need to get the for the purposes that you're actually intending. How do you currently define consent, and how do you ensure that this consent is freely given, informed, specific, and ambiguous? And this is really a loaded question because consent is, there's such a gray area around the term consent, and my definition for consent can be entirely different from someone else's, and there are sort of by-the-book definitions of what consent is. If you can stick as close to those definitions as possible, I think you minimize the liability that you might expose yourself to. Finally, are you collecting any data that's unnecessary to fulfill your processing needs? Again, are you using the right data, and are you using data that is necessary to do what you need to do? The E, empower your people. Do your employees know about this regulation and why it's important? Have you provided your employees with role-specific guidelines on the aspects of the GDPR they need to be aware of? Have you engaged your processor in communications regarding your shared role in ensuring the safety of your client's data? I think what's important about this point is that GDPR, because it is such a big piece of legislation, and it is going to change how you operate, that everyone at your organization really needs to be made aware of the importance of following the rules that are outlined in GDPR, because one little slip up by one person can make the entire company completely non-compliant. Now, how can SmartSimple help? So what I'm going to do in this final section is I'm going to talk about some of the technologies that are in place within the platform that you can really leverage to help you get started in dealing with some of the problems and issues, well, I wouldn't say problems, but issues that are brought up in GDPR. So I'm going to talk about a couple areas: security, data subject rights, procedures and compliance checks, transparency, and finally, what we can do to work together to make sure that not only are you compliant, but what we can do on our side to help facilitate that. So from a security perspective, there are a number of built-in features within the platform to help you out with this. So you have full control over security protocols. Whatever your internal policy is, we can match it and basically put that into production. And that type of flexibility really means it's really crucial in ensuring that we could react quickly, and properly prepare for the rigor that GDPR demands. Now, as I mentioned, again, 80 days from now is when the legislation takes place. The great thing about having full control over your security protocols is that you can make quick changes right away within the platform itself, and it can be reflective of what GDPR is asking of you or requiring from you. Pardon me if I get this word mispronounced, but pseudonymization, and I only use this word because it's pretty prominent throughout the legislation itself, but basically GDPR requires that data be masked so that real data is not revealed. And of course, this prevents the data be mapped back to the data subject. Now, from our perspective, our attribute-based access control, or ABAC, lets you enable and define masks for any field in the system. So essentially, we can help you out with that pseudonymization. Finally, encryption. Now, everything within SmartSimple is encrypted end-to-end. The importance of this feature really goes without saying because most privacy laws really require this, just as GDPR does. So encryption has been, a status, something that has been status quo with us for basically since the inception of the platform. Authorized access. SmartSimple enables you to take additional measures to protect your account, such as enabling multi-factor authentication. So those are things like Google two-factor, FIDO protocol, which is something new, and I'll talk about it in just a minute, session timeout, URL encryption, and any number of our security settings can help out with authorized access control. Security reports. SmartSimple has a security check or an audit feature that was released late last year. I think it may have been 3 or 4 upgrades ago. But basically, it reports on the vulnerabilities of your system. So for those of you who aren't already using it, it's a great way to be able to regularly test, assess, and evaluate your system's security. So again, if you're not using this particular feature and you don't know how to access it, reach out to us and we can show you how to take advantage of it, because again, things like this will become ever more important, especially with legislation like GDPR taking effect. So how can we help you with the data subject rights? So I mentioned earlier that data subject rights are a really important part of the GDPR legislation. The challenge with managing data subject rights is that each data subject could have their own preferences or set of permissions that they've granted you. Thankfully, we've got a number of features that can help you manage that. So the first one is profiles. I think for most of you, SmartSimple users that have been with us for a while will know all about this, but the way profiles are structured in SmartSimple lends itself really well to the complexities that managing a large group of data subject presents. Essentially, we store the data subject's information as a property of a person rather than a property of a thing. And really what that means is that it makes it easy to adjust and define the policies and procedures relating to each individual data subject. Again, all of these things were related to the functionality within the platform itself. If you do need assistance, please reach out to us and we can walk you through how to activate some of these features and functionality. Request tracker. So SmartSimple can help you set up a UTA that actually tracks requests such as access, rectification, or erasure, and help you ensure that you turn these over within that 1-month guideline. So just like you've got Portal set up for a budget manager, for example, you can actually set up a request tracker that actually is its very own UTA that actually tracks all of these requests if you anticipate that you're going to be getting a lot of these things. Right of access. So GDPR's right of access basically allows the data subject to request all information regarding your data. Now what SmartSimple can do is we can actually fulfill this request automatically by enabling a button on a user's profile that opens a PDF of all the relevant information. And again, we can show you how to do that. The right to erasure, or the right to be forgotten, as the other term is. Basically, we will allow you to completely erase a data subject's profile and erase this information from your logs. However, since deleting information might disrupt your reporting, SmartSimple allows you to report on pseudonymized data that's personally unidentifiable but necessary for the report. So there could be situations where you're doing some impact reporting, for example. Perhaps you're planning for next year where you have an individual or a data subject that has asked you to purge some of their information. The problem with that is that it might affect your reporting. So what we're suggesting here is that with pseudonymization, it enables you to continue to keep that record of data, but because we're masking the data, it can't be tracked back to the original data subject. And so you're still able to report on a broad scale the data that you need, but you can't track it back to the original data subject. Procedures and compliance checks. So we can help you document and track procedures and compliance checks. In fact, internally, we use a special UTA that we've created that we call Compliance Tracker to track and manage all the control points we need to account for to remain SOC 2 compliant. And for those of you who aren't aware of what SOC 2 is, it's basically one of the most stringent protocols for security, confidentiality, and privacy for the cloud. So there are a lot of complexities involved with staying compliant with SOC 2, and really this compliance tracker really helps us out. Storage limitation. Again, we can help out with that. GDPR basically requires that you define and limit the amount of time that you hold data for. That's what storage limitation means. Now, in SmartSimple, by establishing policies and linking them directly to related fields, you can actually set the system to auto-delete information after a certain period of time. So again, we can definitely help out with that particular requirement. Data minimization, which again, as I mentioned before, is the type of data that you're actually holding to process. Now, GDPR talks about how data minimization and duplicate data should be minimized to ensure that it isn't being used for other purposes, which I just mentioned. Now, it's easy really for this to get out of hand quickly, especially if numerous duplicates of a piece of data are being created. So the good thing is, and I think most of our clients have been with us for a while, will understand this, is that the platform was really built with the principle of data minimization in mind. So since data subject information is stored to a profile, not to a specific UTA, information only needs to be collected once. So as you well know, one profile gets collected for a particular contact, and all associated data information rolls under that one specific profile. And finally, one of the things that we're actually working on is an application template. So we are working on something that's GDPR compliant at an application form. So when that gets developed, we can definitely share that with you guys. So whether you're tracking grants, a case, or anything else, I think you have to define the parameters of any UTA that holds information on data subjects. So what we can help out with is provide a form for you to input critical information about your UTA, like which categories of personal data are being collected, why personal data is being collected, how long the information is going to be held, things of that nature. And we can also help with other compliance checks as well. So beyond some of the other features I've already mentioned, we also have a library of compliance checklists that you can leverage to ensure that you're meeting every requirement under the guidelines of GDPR. And actually, you can actually create your own templates as well. But some of the templates or checklists that we've created ourselves, which are readily available to you already, are we've got a consent checklist, we've got a lawfulness of processing checklist. We also have an accessibility checklist. So if you're interested in having a look at those things, again, reach out to us and we can provide you with more detail on how to access those things. So transparency was one of the main principles that were outlined in the legislation, and of course we can definitely help out with that. The first thing is obviously an audit trail. So we track changes within SmartSimple, allowing you to provide a full audit trail of all of your processes. And you know, when you're dealing with a legislation that is this robust and this detailed, a proper and detailed audit trail is extremely important. But beyond that, what we can also help it with, and as you well know, is we've got things like ad hoc reporting. So the great thing about the ad hoc reporting is that if you need to assess your consent process, you can actually create a report on it. And now, keep in mind that under the ABAC security protocol, when you share a report with someone who isn't authorized to see the data, the sensitive data is going to be masked or pseudonymized, as GDPR likes to call it. Now, finally, when it comes to records, SmartSimple can help you create records of all of your processing activities, and that's really a major requirement of the legislation. So apart from you being able, taking action in complying with the legislation itself, a lot of these things require tracking, record keeping, reporting, all that good stuff. And of course, it's really important to have that as an audit trail to make sure that if you have a claim against you, that you're protected with that back-end information. And finally, the last thing I want to say is how we can help you in working together. So I mentioned earlier that one of the things that you're going to want to think about in your compliance checklist is your contracts. And you should be engaging in discussions with whatever processor you're working with to make sure that the contracts properly reflect the changes in GDPR. Now, from our perspective, we welcome any of those conversations and any discussion that needs to be involved in terms of talking about how we need to amend your contract to roll in some of the requirements of GDPR. So again, just reach out to us and we can have that conversation. Best practices. One of the things that we're looking at doing is we're trying to put together a working group of clients that we can sort of work together to put together some best practices around GDPR. The thought around that is sort of shared learning is probably more powerful than us all individually doing our research. So if you're interested in joining that working group, please let us know. I think we've got a couple of clients that have already mentioned that they're interested in participating in that, but we haven't run our first session yet, but that is on the short horizon, especially with the legislation really looming. So again, if you're interested, please let us know. You can reach out to me directly, or you can reach out to Sport or even Eric. I'm sure you all work with Eric, to let them know that you're interested in participating in this. And 50 minutes later, that really covers everything that we've uncovered about the GDPR legislation. So I want to thank everyone for spending this time with me to talk about GDPR. Certainly a mouthful for me, but I hope it was helpful for you. What I can do is I can spare a couple minutes for some Q&A. I mean, we are a couple minutes already beyond what our specified time was, but I think it's important that we have some time just to answer any questions you might have, because I did throw a lot of information over at you. So again, if you can see the chat box that the Zoom technology has made available to you, type in your questions in there, and I can answer to my best of my abilities. So let's just wait a couple seconds here for a couple of questions to roll in. I think we've got a couple. Okay. So I mentioned FIDO, and this person's asking specifically about FIDO and multi-factor authentication. The person is asking us to explain what it is and how we can set it up in their system. So basically, FIDO is it's a universal authenticator, and it relies on your fingerprint, and it's a lot more secure than any other authenticator. So the Google authenticators that are really popular these days is even more secure than that. And the FIDO is actually a physical device that's being rolled out in security procedures across all industries. You're going to start seeing it being used for ATMs, even Facebook, and actually the integration for the FIDO protocol is actually going to be available in our next upgrade. So you'll hear a lot more about it when that comes. We have another question. What are the requirements that you need to meet as a processor? What should you be holding? What should you be holding you to? Or what should we be holding you to as a controller? So basically, from a SmartSimple perspective, our main responsibility is really to assist you, the controller, with your requirements. But some of the other things that we have to look after are we have to make sure that we're only processing information after you provide us with instructions to do so. We have to ensure that security of the processing. We have to notify you, the controller, in the event of a data breach. We have to make sure that we're not using another processor to process your data. And in the event that that occur, we obviously have to let you know about that. So those are some of the responsibilities of us as a processor to use a controller. We have another question here about client information, and I think you mentioned earlier before that we talked about erasing data and how we have the ability to help you out with that. So the question is, can you assure that when we delete our client's information under their right to erasure, it's really gone? So the short answer is yes. Yeah, we can ensure that the data has actually been deleted, because once you delete something and it's erased from your system, the deleted information actually works its way through our backup system. Now, actually, after 60 days of sitting on our backup system, that's when it's actually gone. Now, that said, we also have options to delete data from your logs, where your client's data is also live. So we have the ability to do that. Okay. I see a whole lot of other questions here. Just in the interest of time, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to record all of the questions down, and when we send out the recording of the webinar itself, along with the link to the guide, we'll provide answers for all of the additional questions that are listed here, because I'm running out of spit here to talk. and I see a couple of questions here that I probably need a little bit of clarification on. So if it's okay with everyone on the line, I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar here. As I said, all the questions we're going to record, and we'll make sure definitely that every single question is answered around this. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us on this webinar. I hope you found it useful, and I hope you found it informative. And again, make sure that everything that we've told you, you verify with other folks, because again, we're not experts at this, but we wanted to do our best to share with you all the research and information that we've uncovered ourselves. So thanks very much, and I hope you have a great day, and good luck in getting yourselves compliant with GDPR. Take care.